Dara touched the embroidered symbol on the wedding veil, just trying to smooth a wrinkle. The entire bridal chamber went deathly silent. What she didn't know, she just traced a forbidden dark magic sigil that only her bloodline could recognize. And now the Vampire King's fate rested in her hands. Dara Sands had exactly 3 rules for surviving her position at Ravenwood Castle: keep to the shadows, never question the nobility, and absolutely never interfere with royal affairs. Today she was about to shatter all 3. The Ravenwood wedding preparations transformed the ancient castle into something from a fever dream. Black roses cascaded down marble columns, their petals seeming to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight. Crystal and obsidian decorated every surface, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a coronation than a celebration. Dara adjusted her simple maid's uniform and tried to steady her trembling hands as she arranged silver goblets that cost more than her family had earned in generations. More blood wine for the ceremony table, her supervisor, Mistress Kale, hissed with barely concealed irritation. And for mercy's sake, stop looking so terrified. They can smell weakness. Dara nodded, though she knew the woman wasn't exaggerating. Ravenwood Castle wasn't like the village homes where she'd trained. Here in the heart of the Carpathian vampire kingdom, the aristocracy moved with predatory grace, spoke in dialects that predated her language, and looked at humans like her as if deciding between useful and disposable. Vampires, her grandmother Nola had warned before Dara took this position. Not the romanticized creatures from stories. These are ancient, political, and dangerous. You serve the Ravenwood line because our family is bound by oath, but never forget, you are surrounded by beautiful monsters. Dara had tried to dismiss her grandmother's paranoia. But there was something about the way the nobles never aged, the way their skins seemed luminous in the shadows, the way the air itself grew heavy whenever King Morian Ravenwood passed through a room. She loaded her arms with fresh linens for the bridal chamber and headed toward the east tower, keeping her eyes lowered. The castle thrummed with anticipation. Tomorrow, King Morian would marry Lady Aurelia Shade, uniting 2 of the most powerful vampire houses in existence. The servants whispered that it was a love match, that the normally cold, calculating king had been completely transformed by his bride-to-be. That's when she saw it. A discarded handkerchief lay on the stone floor outside the bridal chamber, clearly dropped by one of Lady Aurelia's attendants. Dara bent to retrieve it, intending to return it to the laundry. But as her fingers touched the silk fabric, she froze. Embroidered in thread so dark it seemed to shift and writhe against the white background was a symbol. A very specific symbol. Dara's blood turned to ice. The enthrallment sigil. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, narrating the forbidden texts Nola had made Dara study by candlelight. The mark of the kissing spell, the most dangerous enchantment in existence. It doesn't create love, child. It creates obsession. Devotion. Complete and utter surrender of will. This can't be right, Dara whispered to herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. But her hands knew what her mind wanted to deny. Almost against her will, her fingers traced the sigil's pattern, a gesture her grandmother had taught her, a way to confirm dark magic by bloodline recognition. The moment her finger completed the tracing, the handkerchief blazed with an ethereal purple light that only she could see. The bridal chamber door flew open. 3 of Lady Aurelia's attendants stood in the doorway, their beautiful faces twisted with sudden alarm. Behind them, Dara caught a glimpse of the bride herself, Lady Aurelia Shade in her magnificent wedding gown, surrounded by an aura that now, once recognized, Dara could see clearly, swirling, corrupted energy that clung to her like smoke. "What are you doing?" the head attendant demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut. I was just," Dara stammered, dropping the handkerchief as if it had burned her. But the damage was done. Aurelia herself appeared in the doorway, and her eyes, those stunning violet eyes that had reportedly captivated the king, locked onto Dara with an intensity that made every survival instinct scream run. "You," Aurelia said softly, dangerously. "You touched my personal effects." "Forgive me, my lady," Dara managed, bowing so deeply her forehead nearly touched her knees. "I only meant to return what was dropped." For a long, terrible moment, Aurelia studied her. Dara could feel the weight of that gaze, assessing, measuring, searching for signs that Dara had seen what she shouldn't have. Finally, Aurelia smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "How thoughtful. You're dismissed." Dara fled. Her mind raced as she navigated the servant corridors, her grandmother's warnings now screaming in her memory. The kissing spell requires 3 components: the sigil marked upon the caster's possession, a potion administered over time, and a final binding kiss performed at a sacred ceremony. Once that kiss is given, the victims will belong entirely to the caster. Forever. Tomorrow's wedding ceremony. The final, sacred kiss. King Morian wasn't in love. He was being enchanted, manipulated, stolen from himself and his kingdom. And Dara, invisible, powerless Dara, was apparently the only person in the entire castle who could recognize it. She burst into her small chamber in the servants' wing and pulled out her grandmother's hidden journal, the one Nola had made her swear to protect. Her hands shook as she flipped through pages of careful notes, sketches of symbols, warnings written in Nola's precise hand. The Sands bloodline carries the gift of recognition, her grandmother had written. "We see what others cannot. We remember what others have forgotten. This is why we serve the Ravenwood line, not as mere servants, but as guardians. When the time comes, you will know. And you must act, no matter the cost." "The time has come," Dara whispered to the empty room, terror and purpose warring in her chest. She had less than 24 hours before King Morian exchanged vows with Lady Aurelia. Less than 24 hours before that final, binding kiss would seal his fate and doom the entire kingdom. Dara had lived her entire life in the shadows, trained to be invisible, taught that survival meant silence. But her grandmother's legacy demanded more. The castle bells began to toll, marking the evening before the wedding. Somewhere in the royal wing, King Morian Ravenwood, ancient, powerful, and completely enthralled, was preparing to surrender everything to a woman who had stolen his will. And Dara Sands, the terrified maid who had just uncovered a conspiracy that could shatter the vampire kingdom, had to find the courage to do the one thing servants never did. Speak truth to ultimate power. Even if it cost her everything. Dara had less than 24 hours before King Morian exchanged vows with Lady Aurelia. Less than 24 hours before that final, binding kiss would seal his fate and doom the entire kingdom. She had lived her entire life in the shadows, trained to be invisible, taught that survival meant silence. But her grandmother's legacy demanded more. The castle bells began to toll, marking the evening before the wedding. Somewhere in the royal wing, King Morian Ravenwood, ancient, powerful, and completely enthralled, was preparing to surrender everything to a woman who had stolen his will. Sleep was impossible. Dara spent the night hunched over her grandmother's journal by candlelight, her fingers tracing the careful notations Nola had made decades ago. The text was dense, written in a mixture of old dialect and symbols that made her head ache. But gradually, piece by piece, the truth emerged like bones from shallow grave doubt. The kissing spell, Nola had written in her precise hand, is not merely enchantment. It is theft of the soul itself. The victim believes their devotion to be genuine. Their mind creates false memories of falling in love, of choosing their captor freely. This is what makes it unbreakable by conventional means. You cannot reason someone out of a love they believe they chose. Dara's hands trembled as she turned the page. 3 components are required. First, the enthrallment sigil must be marked upon an object the caster keeps close, often embroidered, tattooed, or carved. Second, a potion must be administered regularly over the course of weeks or months, building the enchantment layer by layer. Third, and most crucial, a binding kiss must be performed during a sacred ceremony, typically a wedding, coronation, or blood oath. This final kiss completes the spell, making it permanent and irreversible. Irreversible. The word seemed to pulse on the page. Dara flipped frantically through the remaining pages, searching for any mention of a counterspell, an antidote, anything. Her grandmother had been meticulous about recording both curses and their cures. There had to be something. Finally, near the back of the journal, she found it. A single page with a sketch of the Ravenwood family crest and a note written in trembling handwriting, as if Nola herself had been afraid even to record the information. The only known counter to the kissing spell is the blood oath of the afflicted's own bloodline. For the Ravenwood line, this would be the ancient declaration sealed in their family crypt, a phrase of will so powerful it can sever any magical binding. But this knowledge was deliberately buried by King Morian's grandfather after it was used to break an alliance he deemed politically inconvenient. The current king may not even know it exists. Dara's breath caught. A counterspell existed. Hidden in the Ravenwood crypt, forbidden and forgotten, but real. She had to reach it. Had to find those words before tomorrow's ceremony. But how could she possibly? A sharp knock at her door made her slam the journal shut. Sands. Mistress Kale's voice cut through the wood. Why aren't you in the kitchens? The pre-wedding breakfast requires all hands. Now. Coming. Dara called, shoving the journal under her thin mattress. The pre-wedding breakfast was chaos incarnate. The great hall had been transformed into an elaborate display of vampire opulence. Tables laden with delicacies that the immortal guests would barely touch, blood wine in crystal decanters, ice sculptures shaped like intertwining ravens and nightshade flowers. Dara moved through it all like a ghost, refilling goblets and clearing plates while her mind raced with impossible calculations. Then she saw him. King Morian Ravenwood entered the hall, and the effect was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-word. Every vampire in the room turned toward him with a mixture of reverence and wariness that reminded Dara he wasn't just royalty, he was apex predator in a room full of predators. He was devastatingly handsome in the way of immortal things, sharp features that seemed carved from marble, dark hair that fell just past his collar, eyes that normally held the cold clarity of winter stars. But those eyes, as Dara watched with her newly awakened awareness, were wrong. Clouded. Distant. As if he were looking at the world through a veil. Lady Aurelia appeared at his side like a vision from a dark fairy tale. Her gown was the color of midnight bleeding into dawn, and her smile was radiant as she took the king's arm. To anyone else, they looked like the perfect couple, beauty and power intertwined. But Dara could see it now. The faint shimmer of magic surrounding Aurelia like a second skin. The way Morian leaned toward her with a devotion that looked almost painful, as if pulled by invisible strings. The too bright glitter in his eyes when he looked at her, obsession masquerading as adoration. My king looks well this morning, Count von Crimson remarked from nearby, his voice carrying just enough doubt to catch Dara's attention. Count von was Morian's oldest confidant, a vampire lord known for his strategic mind and deep suspicion of court politics. He stood apart from the celebratory crowd, a glass of untouched blood wine in his hand, watching the happy couple with an expression Dara recognized, concern poorly masked as celebration. Their eyes met across the hall for just a fraction of a second. And in that moment, Dara made her decision. She had to tell someone. Had to find an ally, no matter how dangerous. Because she couldn't reach the Ravenwood crypt alone, couldn't break into the forbidden chambers where the counterspell waited. She needed Count von Crimson. And she had less than 12 hours to convince him that his king was being stolen by dark magic, before the binding kiss sealed Morian's fate forever. Approaching Count von Crimson was possibly the stupidest thing Dara had ever considered. And she'd spent the last 12 hours contemplating several variations of stupid that would likely get her executed. The breakfast had dissolved into smaller gatherings scattered throughout the castle gardens. Dara watched from behind a marble column as Count von separated from the main crowd, walking toward the eastern terrace with the deliberate stride of someone seeking solitude. This was her chance. Possibly her only chance. Her feet moved before her courage could fail her completely. Count von, she called softly, her voice barely carrying over the fountain's burble. He turned, one elegant eyebrow rising in surprise. Up close, he was even more intimidating, tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had witnessed centuries of court intrigue. Those eyes assessed her now with the clinical precision of someone trained to identify threats. "A maid addressing me directly," he said, his tone conversational but edged with warning. "You're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. I haven't decided which." "Foolish, my lord," Dara admitted, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. "But I have information about the king that I believe you need to hear." Something flickered across his face. Interest, perhaps. Or suspicion. "The king has an entire council for information. I suggest you take your concerns through proper channels." "There isn't time for proper channels," Dara said, desperation making her bold. "The wedding is tonight. And King Morian isn't in love with Lady Aurelia. He's been enchanted by her." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Count Varian's expression didn't change, but his stillness became absolute, the predatory freeze of a vampire deciding whether something was prey or threat. "That," he said quietly, "is an accusation that could see you burned alive before sunset. I hope you have evidence to support such treason." Dara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Yesterday, I found a handkerchief belonging to Lady Aurelia. Embroidered on it was the enthrallment sigil, the mark of a kissing spell. My grandmother taught me to recognize such things. She served the Ravenwood line for 60 years and kept records of forbidden magic specifically to protect against threats like this." "Your grandmother," Vern repeated, and now there was definite interest in his voice. "Dara Sands." Dara blinked in surprise. "You knew her?" Every vampire of a certain age knew Dara Sands. She was infuriatingly perceptive and absolutely incorruptible. He studied Dara with new intensity. "If you're anything like her, you wouldn't make such an accusation lightly. But perception and proof are different things. What makes you certain the king is enchanted rather than simply besotted?" "3 days ago," Dara said, the words tumbling out now, "King Morian signed a decree transferring significant portions of the Ravenwood estate to Lady Aurelia's family. I overheard Lord Theron discussing it with the Treasury Master. He called it unprecedented and politically dangerous." Those were his exact words. Count Varian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wasn't informed of any such decree." "Because the king signed it privately, with only Lady Aurelia present as witness. And yesterday, he dismissed 3 of his oldest advisors, including Lady Meridian, who has served his family for 2 centuries. When she questioned his decision, he told her that Aurelia found her presence uncomfortable, and that his bride's comfort was his primary concern." The Count's hand moved to the terrace railing, gripping the stone with enough force that Dara heard it crack slightly. "I knew about the dismissals. I thought it was simply pre-wedding stress. Morian has always been intensely private about his personal relationships." "This isn't private, my lord. This is obliteration. He's systematically removing everyone who might question Lady Aurelia's influence. And tonight, when he kisses her at the altar, the spell will become permanent. He'll be her puppet forever, and the Ravenwood kingdom will fall under her control." Count Vion stared out at the gardens where nobles mingled and laughed, celebrating a wedding that would destroy everything they knew. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. "I believe you," he said. "Now tell me what we need to do to stop it." The Ravenwood crypt was not a place servants entered. It was barely a place vampires entered. The ancient burial chambers beneath the castle were sealed by blood magic and protected by wards that had stood for 1,000 years. But they had 4 hours until the wedding ceremony, and the counterspell was somewhere in those forbidden depths. Count Vern led Dara through a series of passages she'd never seen before, descending deeper into the castle's foundation with each turn. The air grew colder, thick with the weight of centuries and something else, old magic that made her skin prickle. The entrance requires Ravenwood blood, Vion explained as they reached a massive iron door carved with ravens in flight. Fortunately, the king granted me honorary bloodline status 200 years ago. It should still work. He pressed his palm against the door's center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ravens began to move, their wings spreading and contracting as if breathing. The door swung inward with a groan that sounded almost alive. Darkness yawned before them, absolute and hungry. Vaughn produced a torch that burned with cold blue flame, vampire fire that revealed rather than illuminated. The crypt stretched ahead in a vast corridor lined with alcoves, each containing a stone sarcophagus marked with names that predated written history. The scroll your grandmother mentioned would be in the innermost chamber, Vaughn said, moving forward with cautious precision. Where the first Ravenwood was entombed. But these crypts are protected by more than doors and locks. The family didn't trust even their own descendants with certain knowledge. As if summoned by his words, the temperature plummeted. Dara's breath misted in front of her face. The blue torchlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, she heard it. Whispers in a language that predated words, voices that spoke directly to the primitive parts of her brain that still remembered when humans were prey. Don't listen, Veon commanded sharply. The dead Ravenwoods guard their secrets jealously. They'll try to turn you back. But the whispers intensified, wrapping around Dara's thoughts like cold fingers. Leave this place. You don't belong here. Your bloodline ends in darkness. Turn back while you still can. Dara's feet slowed despite her will. Terror threaded through her veins, primal and overwhelming. Every instinct screamed that she was trespassing in a place humans were never meant to walk. Then she thought of King Morian's clouded eyes. Lady Aurelia's triumphant smile. The binding kiss that would seal a kingdom's fate. My grandmother walked these halls, Dara whispered, forcing her feet forward. Dara Sands came here to learn how to protect the Ravenwood line. I'm her legacy. I belong here. The whispers paused, as if surprised. Then slowly, grudgingly, they receded. Count Vaughn glanced back at her with something that might have been respect. Your grandmother was right to teach you. You have her spine. They reached the innermost chamber, a circular room dominated by a sarcophagus of black stone veined with silver. The name carved into its surface made Dara's breath catch. Aldrich Ravenwood, first of his name, King Eternal. The founder of the bloodline himself. Around the sarcophagus, stone pedestals held various artifacts, a crown of twisted iron, a sword that seemed to drink the torchlight, scrolls sealed with wax that had hardened into something resembling bone. They, Veon said, pointing to a scroll marked with the same raven sigil from the door. The blood oath of breaking. It was sealed here after Morian's grandfather used it to dissolve a marriage alliance. He deemed it too dangerous to keep accessible, a weapon that could shatter any bond, magical or political. Dara reached for the scroll with trembling hands. The moment her fingers touched the aged parchment, warmth flooded through her, not the warmth of fire, but of recognition. As if the magic itself acknowledged her right to hold it. She broke the seal and unrolled the scroll carefully. The words written there were in old dialect, but her grandmother had taught her enough to parse their meaning. It was a declaration of will, a phrase so potent it could sever any magical binding tied to the Ravenwood bloodline. But there was a condition written at the bottom, in smaller script that made her blood run cold. This oath must be spoken by one who loves the afflicted truly, with no enchantment or obligation binding their heart. False love will turn the spell back upon the speaker, binding them instead. It requires genuine love, Dara whispered, looking up at Vion with dawning horror. How can we possibly? The crypt door slammed shut above them with a boom that shook dust from the ceiling. And in the sudden, terrible silence that followed, they heard footsteps descending toward them. Lady Aurelia had found them. The footsteps echoed through the crypt with deliberate slowness, accompanied by the whisper of expensive fabric against stone. Lady Aurelia wasn't rushing. She didn't need to. They were trapped in a tomb with only one exit, and she controlled it. Count Von, her voice drifted down the corridor, melodious and poisonous. How disappointing to find you conspiring in the darkness with a common maid. I had thought you above such desperate theatrics. Varian moved instantly, positioning himself between Dara and the entrance while pressing the scroll into her hands. Hide it, he mouthed silently. Whatever happens, protect that scroll. Dara shoved the parchment inside her uniform bodice just as Lady Aurelia appeared in the archway of the inner chamber. She was breathtaking in her wedding gown, a masterpiece of black lace and silver embroidery that seemed to shimmer with its own light. But her eyes, those beautiful violet eyes, burned with an intelligence that was cold and calculating and utterly merciless. Breaking into the royal crypt on my wedding day, Aurelia said, stepping into the chamber with 3 guards flanking her. They weren't ordinary guards. Their movements were too synchronized, their expressions too blank. Enthralled, Dara realized with sick certainty. Just like the king. That's treason, Count. Even your centuries of service won't save you from execution. I serve the king, not his puppet master, Vern replied, his voice sharp as broken glass. Though I notice you felt compelled to follow us here yourself rather than trust this to your enchanted servants. Afraid of what we might find. Aurelia's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered across her face. I have no idea what paranoid fantasy the maid has filled your head with. King Morian and I are in love. The entire court has witnessed our devotion. Devotion you manufactured with a kissing spell, Dara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I found your sigil, Lady Aurelia. I know what you are. For the first time, Aurelia's attention focused fully on Dara, and the weight of that gaze was like being crushed beneath ice. You know nothing, little maid. You're a servant playing at knowledge she doesn't possess, meddling in affairs that will see you burned alive. Then why are you here? Dara challenged, her grandmother's courage flowing through her veins. If I'm just a delusional servant, why not let Count Von discover that himself? Why chase us into a crypt unless you're terrified of what we might find? The mask slipped. Just for a moment, but long enough for Dara to see the fury beneath Aurelia's perfect composure. Kill them both, Aurelia commanded her guards. Make it look like a crypt collapse. The king will be devastated, but I'll comfort him through his grief. The guards moved with inhuman speed, drawing swords that gleamed with the same dark energy that surrounded their mistress. Vaughn met them with the fluid grace of a vampire who'd survived centuries of court warfare, his own blade appearing in his hand as if summoned from shadow. But 3 enthralled guards against 1 vampire, even an ancient one, were brutal odds. Dara pressed herself against Aldrich Ravenwood's sarcophagus, her mind racing. She had the counterspell. She had the knowledge. But none of it mattered if they died here in the dark before the ceremony even began. Her hand brushed against something on the sarcophagus, a small indentation in the stone, shaped like a handprint. Without thinking, driven by desperate instinct, Dara pressed her palm against it. The tomb blazed with silver light. The sarcophagus lid shattered, and from within, a spectral figure rose, King Aldrich Ravenwood himself, or some echo of him bound to protect his bloodline's secrets. The ghost was magnificent and terrible, composed of silver fire and ancient rage. Who dares disturb my rest? The spectre's voice boomed, filling the chamber with power that made even the enthralled guards stumble backward. Lady Aurelia's eyes went wide with genuine fear. And in that moment of chaos, as the dead king's ghost turned its burning attention toward the intruders who'd brought violence into his sacred rest, Dara saw their chance. Run, she screamed at Von, and together they bolted for the corridor while Aurelia's guards tried desperately to defend against an enemy they couldn't possibly kill. Behind them, Lady Aurelia's scream of frustration echoed through the crypt like a promise of vengeance. They had the counterspell. But now Aurelia knew they had it. And the wedding was in 3 hours. They emerged from the crypt into chaos. Servants rushed through corridors with armfuls of flowers and ceremonial candles. Musicians tuned instruments in the grand chapel. The entire castle hummed with pre-wedding frenzy, blissfully unaware that their king was about to be permanently enslaved by dark magic. Count Von pulled Dara into an alcove as a procession of nobles swept past, their laughter echoing off marble walls. His usual composure had cracked, his jacket was torn from the fight, and something that might have been concern flickered in his ancient eyes. "Aurelia will go straight to Morian," he said quietly, urgently. "She'll tell him we broke into the crypt, that we're conspiring against the wedding. Under the spell's influence, he'll believe every word. Then we need to perform the counter-ritual before she reaches him," Dara said, pulling the scroll from her bodice. But even as she spoke, her stomach twisted with the impossible reality written at the bottom of the parchment. "Except we can't. The oath requires someone who genuinely loves the king. No enchantment, no obligation. Just true love." Varian's expression darkened. A safeguard against weaponizing the ritual. Clever and infuriating. He was silent for a moment, thinking with the strategic precision of someone who'd navigated centuries of political minefields. "We could search for a former lover, perhaps someone from before Aurelia." "There's no time," Dara interrupted. "The wedding starts in less than 3 hours. We'd never find someone, convince them, and reach the king before the binding kiss." The weight of failure pressed down on her like a physical thing. They had the counterspell. They had proof. They had everything except the one impossible ingredient, someone whose love for King Morian Ravenwood was genuine and freely given. A commotion erupted from the direction of the royal wing. Raised voices. The distinct sound of guards mobilizing. "She's already reached him," Vern hissed. "We need to move. Now." He grabbed Dara's wrist and pulled her deeper into the castle, away from the main corridors and into the network of servant passages that honeycombed the walls. Behind them, she could hear Captain Thorne's voice bellowing orders to seal the gates and find the traitors who defiled the royal crypt. "Where are we going?" Dara gasped as they descended a narrow staircase she'd never seen before. "Somewhere Aurelia won't think to look. Somewhere she can't reach easily." Vion pushed through a hidden door into a section of the castle that smelled of age and disuse. The servants' undercroft. These passages were built during the siege wars, designed to move staff during attacks. Most vampires have forgotten they exist. They emerged into a low-ceilinged chamber filled with old furniture and forgotten supplies. Vion barred the door behind them and finally allowed himself to slump against the wall, the exhaustion of their escape catching up with even his supernatural stamina. "We're trapped," Dara said, the reality of their situation settling over her like a burial shroud. "Even if we could reach the king, he's enchanted. He'll never listen to us. He'll have us executed the moment we appear." "Then we don't reach him before the ceremony," Vern said slowly, a dangerous idea forming behind his eyes. "We reach him during it." Dara stared at him. "You want to interrupt a royal vampire wedding? In front of the entire court? That's suicide. It's also the only moment when Morian will be truly vulnerable. The spell isn't complete yet, there's still a sliver of his true self buried beneath Aurelia's enchantment. If we can shock him, break through that final moment before the binding kiss, we might create an opening." "Might," Dara repeated hollowly. "Might," Vion confirmed. "But it's the only chance we have." He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. "I can get you into the chapel. I can create a distraction. But you'll have to be the one to speak the counter-oath. A human voice carries less threat. He might listen for a crucial second longer before Aurelia's guards kill you." "Before they kill me," Dara echoed, her mouth dry. "I won't lie to you, Dara Sands. This is almost certainly a death sentence. Aurelia will make sure of it." He paused, giving her space to process. "If you want to run, to escape while the wedding proceeds, I won't stop you. You've done more than duty required. Above them, the castle bells began to chime. 2 hours until the ceremony. Dara thought of her grandmother, who'd spent 60 years protecting a bloodline that barely acknowledged her existence. Who'd compiled forbidden knowledge and passed it down because someone had to remember. Someone had to stand guard. I'm not running, Dara said quietly. Show me how to get into that chapel. The chapel filled with guests like a beautiful nightmare coming to life. Dara watched from behind a carved screen in the servants' gallery, her heart hammering so violently she was certain the vampires below could hear it. Every noble house in the Carpathian kingdom had sent representatives, their immortal faces radiant with anticipation as they filled the ancient pews. Count Vion crouched beside her, his expression grim. The ceremony follows the traditional structure. Vows, exchange of rings, then the binding kiss. The moment Aurelia's lips touch his, the spell becomes permanent. You'll have seconds at most. How do I even reach him from up here? Dara whispered, studying the distance between the gallery and the altar below. 20 feet at least, with nothing but air and certain death between them. You don't stay up here. Vion pointed to a narrow passage that led down behind the altar. That connects to the sacristy. I'll create a distraction at the moment of the vows, something dramatic enough to turn every head in the room. You use those seconds to reach the altar. When you have Morian's attention, speak the counter-oath. Loudly. Clearly. Don't hesitate. And then we pray that 300 years of Ravenwood magic is stronger than Aurelia's spell. He met her eyes. If this doesn't work, Dara, if he doesn't break free, run. Don't try to fight. Just run and don't look back. The chapel doors opened with a sound like thunder. King Morian Ravenwood entered, and the assembled nobles rose as one. He was devastating in his ceremonial black, ancient power radiating from him like cold fire. But his eyes, those winter star eyes, were still clouded, still wrong. He moved down the aisle with mechanical precision, a puppet being walked to his own execution. Behind him, Lady Aurelia appeared like a vision of dark perfection. Her wedding gown seemed woven from midnight itself, trailing shadows that moved independently of any breeze. She smiled at the assembled court with triumphant grace, a conqueror in bride's clothing. Dara's hands trembled as she clutched the scroll. The words of the counter-oath burned in her memory, practiced 100 times in the Undercroft. But there was still the impossible condition, genuine love, freely given. She didn't love King Morian. She barely knew him beyond his reputation and his title. Unless. The thought struck her like lightning. The oath didn't require romantic love. It required true love, the kind her grandmother had shown the Ravenwood line for 60 years. The kind that demanded sacrifice without expectation of reward. The kind that said I will stand between you and darkness even if it costs me everything. That kind of love, Dara had in abundance. The officiant raised his hands, and the chapel fell into reverent silence. Dearly beloved, we gather to witness the union of two ancient houses. Count Vern squeezed her shoulder once, then disappeared into the shadows. Dara crept toward the narrow passage, every step carrying her closer to either salvation or execution. The ceremony had begun. And she had perhaps 5 minutes before the binding kiss sealed the king's fate forever. The vows began with ancient words that predated modern language, spoken in a dialect that made the air itself thrum with power. Dara pressed herself against the cold stone of the sacristy passage, watching through a gap in the carved screen as King Morian repeated phrases that would bind him eternally to his captor. Lady Aurelia's smile was radiant and terrible. She knew she'd won. In moments, the Ravenwood kingdom would be hers, its king a beautiful puppet to parade before the court. Do you, Morian Ravenwood, take this woman as your eternal companion? The officiant intoned. To bind your blood to hers, your power to hers, your fate to hers, for all the nights yet to come. I do, Morian said, his voice hollow and distant. The crowd murmured approval. Aurelia's hand tightened on his, her violet eyes gleaming with triumph. Then by the ancient rites, I pronounce you. The eastern stained glass window exploded inward. Count Von crashed through in a shower of colored glass and ancient lead, his coat billowing dramatically as he landed in a crouch among the screaming nobles. Assassins, he roared, drawing his sword. The king is under attack. Protect the throne. Chaos erupted. Nobles scattered. Guards drew weapons. The officiant stumbled backward. And for one crucial moment, every eye in the chapel turned toward the shattered window. Dara ran. She burst from the sacristy passage and crossed the altar space in 5 desperate strides, her simple maid's uniform a dark blur against the chapel's opulence. She could see Aurelia's head whipping around, could see the sorceress's eyes widening with fury as she recognized the threat. "Stop!" Aurelia shrieked, but Dara was already there, already positioning herself between the king and his bride, already pulling the scroll from her bodice with shaking hands. King Morian stared at her with those clouded eyes, confusion and enchantment warring across his face. "Who?" "Your Majesty," Dara gasped, her voice cracking but determined. "Her kiss isn't love, it's a spell." The chapel froze. 300 immortal faces turned toward her in unified shock. "Guards!" Aurelia commanded. "Seize that treasonous." But Dara was already speaking, the words of the counteroath tumbling from her lips in the old dialect her grandmother had made her memorize. "By blood of the first Ravenwood, by will unbound and heart untainted, I speak truth into darkness. I, who serve without enchantment, who stand without obligation, who love without spell or poison, I break the chains that bind this king. By iron, by fire, by the eternal dawn, let him be free." The scroll in her hands blazed with silver light so bright it bleached the color from the world. Aurelia screamed, a sound of pure rage and terror. And King Morian Ravenwood gasped as if surfacing from deep water, the clouds vanishing from his eyes as the enchantment shattered like glass. For one crystalline moment, he saw everything clearly. The spell, the manipulation, the woman before him who'd nearly stolen his soul. His eyes met Dara's, fully lucid for the first time in months. "You," he whispered, his voice raw with shock and dawning gratitude. "You saved me." Then Lady Aurelia's dark magic exploded outward in a wave of furious power. The wave of dark magic sent nobles crashing into pews and shattered the remaining stained glass windows. Aurelia stood at the center of the destruction, her wedding gown dissolving into something that looked like living shadow, her beautiful face twisting with hatred that no longer needed to hide behind charm. "You think breaking one spell ends this?" she snarled, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "I've spent months positioning my family, consolidating power, ensuring that even without the king as my puppet, the Ravenwood line falls." King Morian moved with a speed that blurred reality, placing himself between Aurelia and Dara. The enchantment might be broken, but he was still ancient, still powerful, still very much a vampire king who'd just discovered he'd been violated by the woman he'd nearly married. "Your family's assets are frozen as of this moment," Morian said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your claims to Ravenwood lands are void. And you," his eyes blazed with cold fire, "are banished from this kingdom for the crime of enchanting royalty. A crime punishable by death, which I'm choosing to commute out of mercy you don't deserve." Aurelia laughed, the sound sharp and broken. "You think you can simply banish me? I have allies, Morian. Nobles who owe me favors. Guards still under my—" "No," Count Von interrupted, emerging from the chaos with his sword still drawn. "You don't." The moment the spell broke, so did every lesser enchantment tied to it. Your enthralled guards are waking up confused and angry. Your allies are discovering that the favors they thought they owed you were manufactured by subtle compulsion magic. He smiled without warmth. "You're alone, Aurelia. And in a room full of vampires who really don't appreciate being manipulated." The nobles were rising now, and their expressions ranged from fury to humiliation. Several had clearly been under minor enchantments themselves, just enough to make them support Aurelia's rise, to ignore the warning signs, to celebrate a wedding that should have raised every possible red flag. Aurelia's composure finally shattered completely. "This isn't over," she hissed, her form beginning to dissolve into shadow and smoke, an escape spell, Dara realized. "The Shade family will remember this insult. We will." "You'll do nothing," Maureen said flatly, and gestured. Silver chains materialized from the air itself, ancient Ravenwood magic that wrapped around Aurelia's dissolving form and dragged her back into solidity. "Because you're not leaving until you've faced trial for your crimes. And then you'll spend the next century in the lowest cell of my dungeons, contemplating the consequences of trying to steal a kingdom." Aurelia screamed as the guards, now free of her influence, dragged her away. The chapel fell silent. Maureen turned slowly to face Dara, who was still standing at the altar, shaking from adrenaline and shock and the realization that she was somehow still alive. "You," the king said softly, approaching her with careful movements, as if she was something precious and fragile. "You risked everything. Why?" Dara met his eyes, those clear, winter-star eyes, finally free of corruption. "Because it was right," she said simply. "Because my grandmother taught me that some duties matter more than survival." "Your grandmother was Dara Sands." "Yes. She saved my father once, from a poison that should have killed him." Maureen's expression softened with something that looked like wonder. "And now her granddaughter has saved me from a fate worse than death." He reached for her hand, and Dara let him take it. "Dara Sands served my family in the shadows for 60 years, Maureen said, his voice carrying through the silent chapel so every noble could hear. "She protected us without recognition, without reward, simply because she believed some oaths transcend station and survival. Her granddaughter has proven that legacy runs deeper than blood." He turned to address the assembled court, still holding Dara's hand. "From this day forward, Dara Sands is named protector of the Ravenwood line and advisor to the throne. She will stand beside me not as a servant, but as an equal, recognized, honored, and irreplaceable." The court erupted in applause, though whether from genuine support or political necessity, Dara no longer cared. Count Vion approached, bowing to them both with a slight smile. "Well," he said dryly, "this wasn't the wedding anyone expected, but I'd argue it's a far better outcome." Maureen's lips curved into the first genuine smile Dara had ever seen from him. "Agreed." He looked down at her, something warm and wondering in his ancient eyes. "Though I suspect the kingdom will have much to say about a king who fell for his maid." "Not his maid," Dara corrected softly, finding her courage at last. "His protector. His equal. And perhaps, eventually, something more." "Eventually," Maureen agreed, and the promise in that single word sent warmth flooding through her chest. As Count Vion orchestrated the cleanup and the nobles dispersed in scandalized whispers, as the shattered chapel slowly emptied and the chaos of the interrupted wedding faded into history, Maureen drew Dara aside into a quiet alcove. "Thank you," he said simply. "For seeing what no one else could. For having the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. For loving my kingdom enough to risk everything." "It wasn't just the kingdom I was protecting," Dara admitted, surprising herself with the truth. Maureen's eyes widened slightly. Then, moving with careful deliberation, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, genuine, unenchanted, and freely given. "Then let me spend the rest of my very long life," he murmured against her skin, "proving myself worthy of that protection." And as Dara Sands stood in the ruins of a wedding that never was, held in the arms of a king she'd saved from darkness, she finally understood what her grandmother had known all along. That true power wasn't found in crowns or spells or ancient bloodlines, but in the courage to speak truth when the entire world demanded silence. The kingdom would remember this night forever, not as the wedding of King Maureen Ravenwood, But as the night, a maid in a simple black uniform looked at ultimate power and said, "No, this is wrong," and in doing so, saved them all.